It seems we're right back where we started.
By the way, I think they're starting another one. Did you see that? I see these phonies, the do-nothing Democrats. They said today that Putin wants to be sure that Trump gets elected. Here we go.
The question of whether Russians have been meddling in American elections have been a contentious topic of debate over the last 4 years.
Vladimir Putin thinks that Donald Trump should be president of the United States, and that's why Russia is helping you get elected so you'll lose to him.
Whether it's them contributing directly to candidates, swaying voters through propaganda via Facebook, propagating fake news, or leaning on one candidate and lending them unwanted support. These lingering questions have been haunting America like boogeymen. No one's sure of the truth. No one's certain of the credibility of the allegations. But America has let it occupy its mind, live rent-free in its news cycles, repeating variations of the same concern month after month, year after year, without really getting anywhere. And yet, America seems to dismiss everything the Russians say on the matter, even when it seems like they're telling the truth. The following is an audio clip from Putin's closest aide, who will be introduced later.
Foreign politicians complain that Russia is meddling in elections and referendums across the world. In actual fact, it's much more serious than that. Russia is meddling in their brains, changing their consciousness, and they have no idea what to do about it.
The logical course of action would be to dismiss this statement too. Whether or not the Russians have been meddling in American elections or not, what's the difference between a statement like this and the hundreds of junior terrorist organizations minutes after 9/11 claiming they were behind the attacks to chase clout? What lends this any credibility? Well, to answer that, we need to have a look at the man who said these words. But before we bring him out, let's go back a few decades to right when the Soviet Union ended. The year is 1991, and Russia is in shambles.
Good evening. The stunning overthrow of Mikhail Gorbachev by communist hardliners dominates the news this Monday.
The Soviet Union had just collapsed, and the interim government inherited the monumental task of figuring out how to go from a communist-style government to a fully functioning nation, wrestling ideas of what sort of national identity it wanted and how the economy would be organized. In essence, they were in the middle of switching operating systems. While these philosophical debates were taking place in the Kremlin, in the meantime, all the previously state-owned companies fell into the hands of a very few wealthy businessmen that acted quickly. These companies acquired all the major corporations, effectively making them, the owners, oligarchs of a newly independent Russia. And they were referred to as so in the media for the next few decades. They placed a man they could trust into the role as president. Boris Yeltsin was a drunk, but he was loyal. He made it very favorable for the oligarchs to conduct business freely, and they took advantage of the Manchurian candidate for a while until he started to fall out of favor with the public. He was a national embarrassment, often red in the face while delivering slurred speeches. He wasn't useful from a diplomatic standpoint as well. And ever since the first cracks started to show, the oligarchs had started grooming a largely unknown young KGB agent that had proved himself throughout his career. He was quiet, effective, and strategically placed to transition as president when the time was right. But the problem was nobody in Russia really knew who he was. While Vladimir Putin had been rising through the ranks of KGB officer, to mayor of Moscow, to prime minister, in a parallel timeline was a tale of a rather unusual rise to power of a man by the name of Vladislav Surkov. He was a bodyguard for one of the aforementioned oligarchs of Russia, Mikhail Khodorkovsky. Before that, a martial arts student, and then studied theater for 3 years before dropping out. not much is known about his past. We only have what's on record about him, like when his former boss said that he noticed Surkov's business knowledge and his way with words, and decided he would be far more useful in a corporate position than as a bodyguard. It was a brilliant judge of character. Khodorkovsky placed him in a PR role at one of his companies, and he quickly rose to the top, producing successful campaigns that raised the value of all his companies, culminating in an event that many people in Russia still remember to this day. This may not seem like much, but getting a company's commercial onto Soviet television, many Soviets didn't even really understand what they were seeing. The oligarchs, however, did, and they took a great curiosity into this character, Vladislav Surkov. His way with words, the way he seamlessly downloaded complex ideas into the public consciousness through his marketing campaigns. They deemed him an invaluable asset. Vladimir Putin was a quiet but loyal character. He had the backing, he just needed a public face now. And the oligarchs knew who the perfect PR guy would be for their next candidate. They allowed them to meet, and Surkov and Putin got along famously. It's difficult to think of a greater dynamic duo during that era, or a prouder coach. Through a series of very effective PR campaigns for Putin, all meticulously orchestrated by Surkov, he established Putin's image as a patriot, a protector of the motherland and its conservative values, and one interested in re-establishing Russia's preeminence in the world, by emphasizing the tragedy that territories that rightfully belong to Russia, such as Ukraine, have fallen out of its control during the fall of the Soviet Union, and was their God-given mandate to take back. These sentiments struck a chord with the Russian public. They were in a rut and were desperately in need of someone strong to pull them out, a father figure. Putin found his role, and Surkov created it. He was the oligarchy's man, but now he was also the people's, and this solidified Surkov's utility in Putin's eyes.
Vladislav Surkov.
Vladislav Surkov.
Vladislav Surkov. He was a power behind the throne. He was
The leading figure behind the scenes in
the grey cardinal of Russian politics, also the puppet master, quite theatrical titles.
A renowned ideologist and was thought of as a leading figure behind the scenes in the government.
They were one hell of a duo. Now, there's some worth in comparing these two to the world of sports. Here we have two all-stars that have completely turned their franchise around, not through brute force or a huge war chest, because, let's remember, Russia was in a state of turmoil. They were in a very weak position financially to bring about any meaningful political change. Low budget, not a lot of options, the system in disarray from past losses. Much like the 0-2 Oakland Athletics baseball team. Billy Beane, the GM of the Oakland A's at the time, and his assistant, Peter Brand, had the monumental task of turning the franchise around using only what they had, a terribly meager budget. They developed a strategy of using statistics to spot undervalued players that they can build a roster with for cheap. Beane and his assistant built a brilliant strategy for baseball. Putin and Surkov did the same. Much more Machiavellian, but a strategy nonetheless. Putin and Surkov got to work as soon as Boris Yeltsin, on December 31st, 1999, resigned from office in a surprise announcement leaving the presidency to Putin, who was the prime minister at the time. A move undoubtedly blessed by the oligarchs. Putin and Surkov immediately got their plans set in motion. In the early days of Putin's presidency, there wasn't much weight behind the position of president relative to where the real power presided, which were with the oligarchs. Surkov's first assignment from the oligarchs was to elevate Putin's image in the eyes of the public consciousness, which he did masterfully. But he had bigger plans for Putin. Surkov's objective was consolidating media power under Putin. With the way industry was compartmentalized, those news and broadcasting companies were all under rule of the oligarchs. Control the oligarchs, control the media. Control the media, you own the stage, where Surkov felt most comfortable. One of the main pillars upon which Putin based his early public campaigns was to rid the cozy relations between the Kremlin and industry. To the oligarchs, this was just standard rhetoric to appease the crowds when inequality started to become a hot topic. However, Surkov engineered a PR campaign that delivered on these campaign promises by targeting oligarchs and arresting them on trumped-up charges. Surkov assured that this is just theater, that it'll only strengthen the image of Putin, their man in office, which will ultimately benefit them in the long run. If everyone just plays their roles in this short play, the deep state will be in a much stronger position after the standing ovation from the Russian public. There was a natural unease among the ruling class, but they went with it. This went on for some months. One of the oligarchs spent 3 days in jail due to embezzlement, misappropriation of funds, assets frozen here and there. The crowd loved it. The final act of the play ended when 21 of the richest businessmen in Russia were called to the Kremlin for a mandatory meeting. This was not part of the oligarch script. Putin greeted each member, every one of them looking towards him, situated in the center, when he made an announcement. He made it very clear, referencing his previous boss by name, that he was no Boris Yeltsin, and that those days of the Kremlin leaning on the oligarchy were over. He went on to say that they may keep their companies, and that he was simply asking for their cooperation, a thinly disguised word for loyalty. And the stage was set. Surkov had installed a meta where all authority in Russia now started at the center, where Putin resides, and looked outwards, first to the layer of loyal oligarchs, which effectively meant control of their companies, most importantly the media companies. Surkov and Putin now own the media, which meant that they can control the dialogue of any issue, real or created. They use this to completely cleanse the oligarch class of any dissidence to the president, in the name of draining the swamp. And with their carefully crafted news segments that vilified the disloyal oligarchs, it only took a handful of high-profile cases to make it abundantly clear that the rest fall into line or face the same fate. After they saw how much Mikhail Khodorkovsky was punished for failing to fall in line, it became clear that their fortunes were only theirs by the good graces of Putin and Surkov. All of these events were just scenes out of a play in Surkov's theater. Media company presidents were just pawns on this chessboard where a greater game was being played. Surkov's vision for Putin's presidency was far longer than anyone had imagined. And now that he had solidified public support around Putin and had full control of the media, he was able to begin his second act. Although Putin's image to the public had largely been established in a favorable light, it wasn't enough to cover for the serious inadequacies in the economy. Ironically, the wealth gap between the rich and poor in Russia had increased 100-fold since the days of Soviet Russia. The public had grown wary, and the few arrests made of oligarchs couldn't hide the true fact that living conditions had not improved in any meaningful way. Resistance movements were starting to sprout up in different corners of the country. Protests were becoming much more common. Surkov created a fund and covertly supported these movements. Putin had full knowledge that Surkov was funding anti-Putin movements. He then funded far-right groups in the country as well that would fight these anti-fascist movements. With the snap of his finger, he created Nation, a pro-Putin youth group that Western critics have compared to Hitler's youth. He would fund pro-gay movements and their demonstrations, and then fund major Orthodox Christian groups the next month to protest those same human rights groups. For a period of time, it was pandemonium. Protest movements of every hot topic issue took turns mobbing town squares, all on Surkov's shadowy schedule, with his media commentating the evening news, to go with all the action directing the public on exactly how these events were to be understood, emphasizing stress points to make certain issues bigger, other unscheduled events smaller, controlling every single event of this grand play that he had been orchestrating. They were all just characters dancing in unison to Surkov's tune. At the climax of his performance, he let it be known to the public that this was exactly what he was doing. Surkov pulled back the curtain and ushered Russia into a post-truth world. None of it was real, but more importantly, nothing will ever be real. Absolutely, there was outrage. People organized, took to the streets, mass demonstrations were set, riots even broke out. But as Surkov looked along, something magical happened. They started to fight each other. They had thought they spotted Surkovian agents in the demonstrations, or had they? Was this demonstration they were in truly a resistance movement that could potentially bring about meaningful change, or were they yet again in just another production of Surkov's theater? And so it was. All new demonstrations, all across the board, started to subside in Russia. Just the ones that Surkov deemed useful would put on performances, all to his timetable, in front of his cameras. Now, to illustrate the significance of Surkov's magnum opus in more familiar terms, if you're an American, it would be the equivalent of one day watching the news and the director of the CIA comes out and announces that every movement we thought we knew, Black Lives Matter, Antifa, Occupy Wall Street, Westboro Baptist Church, alt-right movements, Tea Party movement, even 9/11 truthers, they were all meticulous orchestrations of the CIA, and that this is just the way life would be from now on. Before this gets heavier, back to Billy Beane. Billy Beane developed a strategy around the theory that on-base percentage and slugging percentage are better indicators of offensive success. He convinced the A's that these qualities were cheaper to obtain on the open market than more historically valued qualities such as speed and contact. The A's didn't win with this strategy, but Billy Beane and Peter Brand's fingerprints could be seen on the 2003 Florida Marlins season, 2004 Boston Red Sox, the 2008 Tampa Bay Rays, all teams that adopted the metrics Beane developed. He changed the game of baseball by introducing a system that could be adapted by any team. The terrifying thing is that the same could be said for Putin and Surkov. Surkov developed a system of winning where the whole population is effectively debilitated by their own ability to process what is true in the very world they live in. Surkov's fingerprints were starting to be seen in other regimes and administrations halfway across the globe. Other platforms have started to install his operating software. North Korea's regime had made generational efforts to control every single facet of life in their quest for control. Their operating system revolves around the cult of personality, an all-encompassing program. Surkov and Putin build a system where the truth is hidden in plain sight, and everyone has given up on trying to find it. In contemporary Russia, unlike the old USSR or present-day North Korea, the stage is constantly changing. The country is a dictatorship in the morning, a democracy at lunch, an oligarchy by supper time, while backstage, oil companies are expropriated, journalists killed, billions siphoned away. Surkov is at the center of the show. It's a strategy of power based on keeping any opposition there may be constantly confused. A ceaseless shape-shifting that is unstoppable because it's undefinable. They truly live in what Surkov has coined the post-truth world. The truth doesn't matter anymore, simply because it doesn't exist. In May 2018, the House Intelligence Committee released more than 3,000 Facebook and Instagram ads that ran continuously from 2015 to 2017, peaking during the election season. They were bought by Russia's Internet Research Agency and planted in social media platforms. If we take a look at a selection of these ads, we'll find that their purpose is clearly to stoke the flames of division among the US public. Many of the ads, placed by Russians posing as Americans, didn't endorse a specific candidate, but spread inflammatory messages on sensitive subjects such as immigration and race to amplify fault lines in American life, targeting users from specific backgrounds in tight races in key states. These ads were seen by an approximate 100 million Americans during the election season. That's 1 in 3 Americans who have at one point or another at least glanced at one of these Russian-sponsored ads. It's impossible to quantify the effect this had on the turnout of the previous presidential election. But one thing does seem clear. It's that Surkov has been here, and he's employing the same exact technique he's done at home, but this time, weaponizing it to sow the seeds of discord in adversary nations. And after that's been done, in his signature move, he announces it. And with the snap of his finger, America's now in his reality show. America's facing another election, and we're right back where we started. How can America come to grips with the reality that this country is utterly equipped to deal with these external threats? Not because we lack the technology. It's no longer a simple war between US and Russia. This strategy, popularized by Surkov, has already spread. Surkov's virus thrives in all the areas democracy falls short. We may be able to hunt down its creator, but the technology is already out in the world, shifting shapes and changing our worldview. Maybe Surkov funded this video. Welcome to the post-truth world.